My name is Eli Ratner. I'm the Deputy Director of the Asia Program at CNAS. Again, thanks to everyone for coming out today. We have a video set of remarks from Dr. Carl Thayer that we're going to show in just a minute to kick us off. Probably everyone in the room knows Dr. Thayer. He's clearly one of the leading experts on Vietnamese security issues, South China Sea, and ASEAN. He's an emeritus professor down at the University of New South Wales in Australia and couldn't be here physically today, but did go through the trouble of making a presentation for us, and there should be a set of slides. There are some extra copies floating around the room. For those of you who are able to see the screen here, that should suffice. After that, we are going to hear from Dr. Son, adding a Vietnamese perspective on these issues. Dr. Son is the Deputy Director General of the Vietnam Institute of East China Sea Studies and has worked ASEAN issues in Vietnam's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has a PhD from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, which gracefully hosted a delegation from CNAS last year. So we have good friends there. We'll then hear from Dr. Satu Lemay, who is going to offer some thoughts dissecting Assistant Secretary Danny Russell's testimony, very important testimony, significant, I think, and talk a little bit about what it means looking through the ASEAN lens and what we should glean from it and what challenges and opportunities lie ahead. And then we'll hear from two folks who are familiar faces to the Asia Watcher community here in Washington, Yuki Tatsumi, Senior Associate of the East Asia Program at the Stimson Center, and Walter Lohman, the Director of the Asia Program at the Heritage Foundation. So we will start off with the video, and then we'll turn to Dr. Son.
Good morning. I'm Carl Thayer, Professor Emeritus at the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. I'd like to thank the Center for New American Security and particularly Dr. Pat Cronin for inviting me to address you through the means of video. And that wouldn't be possible without the assistance of the Creative Media Unit here at the University of New South Wales, so I'd like to thank them as well. I've divided my talk today into three parts. One will focus firstly on ASEAN and how it addresses maritime security issues. The second part will address how ASEAN works with its external dialogue partners to address regional security. And I'd like to end by looking at the agenda for maritime security this year and into the near-term future. So now let me turn to part one. And I want to begin with four sweeping generalizations. Maritime security had no particular focus in ASEAN until 2010, and now it has been institutionalized in several multilateral institutions. Discussion on maritime security has moved from very general to specific practical activities. Maritime security was once seen only as state security. It's now viewed as a regional ASEAN security concern. And maritime security is definitely on the ASEAN agenda at the highest level. It's set within the framework of building an ASEAN community by 2015 and creating, among that, an ASEAN political security community, and that's where maritime security nests. There is a blueprint for this political security community which gives guidance, and part of that guidance is it separates the South China Sea issues from broader maritime security, and it's to implement a 2002 Declaration on Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea agreed with China, and at the same time address maritime security by establishing, which it did, an ASEAN Maritime Forum. Now, as a result of the coming into effect of the Charter in 2008, ASEAN structure will change in terms of its nomenclature. The highest level, the ASEAN Summit and Heads of Government. It is preceded by a consultative council of foreign ministers, which is now known as the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting. And beneath them are three community councils: political security, economic, and socio-cultural, and it's the political security community that's as important to us. If we look at the more recent meetings now of the ASEAN foreign ministers and the ASEAN Summit, how do they address regional security? Well, the annual ministerial meeting in Brunei last year separated, as I said, maritime security and made broad commitments and statements that it was important to regional well-being. It also addressed the South China Sea by urging the implementation of cooperative programs set out under the Declaration of Conduct of Parties. And the ministers were tasked later by the summit to work actively with China to move quickly to conclude an agreement on the Code of Conduct. Now, the ASEAN summit merely endorses activities and suggestions by the foreign ministers, and it rarely sets new policy. But it insisted that ASEAN should leverage its institutions in dealing with external powers, giving guidance to make ASEAN central to regional maritime security concerns. It once again reiterated its support for the DOC and consultations with China, and endorsed the idea of a hotline. Now, if we look more specifically at the ASEAN political security community, we can see it consists of a meeting of ASEAN defense ministers, ADMM, other security agencies, and the ASEAN Maritime Forum. Now, if I turn to the ASEAN defense ministers meeting, its structure consists of informal meetings of chiefs of defense, and annually the senior defense officials meet to prepare the agenda for the defense ministers based on inputs from the chiefs of Army, which holds separate meetings, chiefs of Navy, of concern to us, chiefs of Air, and chiefs of Intelligence. The ADMM has adopted 3-year work plans, adopt concept papers on a whole variety of topics relevant to maritime security, and has begun to conduct tabletop exercises, the first practical steps. If we look at the 7th ADMM meeting, they adopted concept papers on defense interaction, logistics, humanitarian mine action, and the arrangement of the co-chairs. The workhorse is the ASEAN Chiefs of Navy meeting. They were set up originally in 2001, but they now meet annually since 2011. Their remit is to enhance cooperation and interoperability and regional maritime security and stability through various initiatives. And these have taken place in great detail, the 5th, 6th, and 7th meetings of the chiefs. Let me just focus on the more recent one, the 7th meeting that was held in the Philippines. It endorsed a series of bilateral and multilateral joint and coordinated patrols and activities that had been carried out previously. It has agreed to implement an ASEAN greeting protocol at sea when warships pass and meet each other, and directed the establishment of hotlines. There are young naval officer exchanges in the works and practical exercises. So that was the ASEAN defense ministers. Let me turn to another body, the ASEAN Maritime Forum. Its remit is a very broad one related to the 3 pillars of the ASEAN community: the political security, economic, and social culture. It's in the process of institutionalizing itself and has asked for advice from the ASEAN Secretariat as to how to accomplish it. Its most recent meeting, the 4th AMF, discussed in broad terms how to build trust and confidence and cooperate at sea. I'd like to turn to part 2 and look at ASEAN-centered dialogue and cooperation. And we have 2 parallel paths: those conducted through the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is ASEAN plus members across East and South Asia, and the so-called ASEAN Plus, where ASEAN has reached out to its dialogue partners. The long-standing one with which you'll be familiar is the ARF, or the ASEAN Regional Forum. It has a program on maritime security with 3 priority areas: intelligence and information exchanges, confidence building measures on maritime security, and capacity building by maritime law enforcement agencies. At the most recent meeting of the ASEAN Regional Forum, an important decision was made, and that was to invite to its intersessional meeting on maritime security representatives from the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus expert working group on maritime security, and I'll be discussing that in a moment. So now let me turn to the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus. That includes 8 dialogue partners: the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, Russia, and China. This is the premier venue for strategic dialogue in defense and security among ASEAN and its major external partners, and it focuses on practical cooperation. It does that through initially 5 and now 6 expert working groups. The most important to us is maritime security, but there is overlap with humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, a focus on peacekeeping, counterterrorism, military medicine, and mine clearance. That's the new body. The second ADMM Plus meeting took place in Brunei, and it meets now every 2 years, and discuss and approve the setting up of an expert working group on humanitarian mine action. And it discussed how the defense sector could collaborate with the security officials in cybersecurity, bioterrorism, transnational trafficking, and pandemic diseases. But the workhorse of the ADMM is the expert working group on maritime security, currently co-chaired by Australia and Malaysia, and they'll relinquish that spot this year. They conducted 4 key activities: humanitarian assistance in military medicine, counterterrorism, a field training exercise on maritime security, and peacekeeping. These involve ASEAN navies interacting not only with themselves, but with their more advanced partners. Finally, let me turn to the other plus organization, the Expanded Maritime Forum, and I'll deal with that in brief. It's still a work in progress, because its remit is to address those 3 broad pillars. They are still looking to develop the priorities that it and its dialogue partners should develop. They want to focus on freedom of navigation, military law enforcement. So as I say, it's a work in progress. So that leads me to my third part. How do these institutions all relate to the most important leaders-led forum of heads of government and state, the East Asia Summit? That composes the ASEAN 10 memberships, China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, plus the United States and Russia. The East Asian Summit has 6 priority areas, and not one of them is directly related to maritime security. And maritime security is raised by leaders when they attend either at the summit or during the informal retreat. At the 8th East Asia Summit, the most recent one, we just got very general statements about wanting to maintain peace and security, the non-use of force, and upholding of international law. This broad statement was made because of territorial disputes in the South China Sea, and the lack of specifics was, of course, due because China was present and would object to anything that was binding on it. So the East Asia Summit it will continue to meet. It's important, and it raises the question whether the regional architecture shouldn't be streamlined. And in the diagram that I've shown you here, one suggestion is to group all the present multilateral bodies under the East Asia Summit. Now, I haven't dealt with the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC, which is economic, but I have dealt with the ARF, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus, and the enlarged ASEAN Maritime Forum. And the idea is that when these ministerial bodies meet, they could cough up proposals to the East Asia Summit itself. If we're looking beyond the present into the future, the most important is this little red arrow at the bottom, where we have a linkage between the ASEAN Regional Forum's intersessional meeting on maritime security and its invitation for the expert working group members under the Defense Ministers Plus to join them in their talks. So we now have a synergy and a breaking down of some of these walls. ASEAN, its focus will be on intensifying building the political security community with a deadline of the end of 2015. Its immediate priority is on consultations with China related to the South China Sea, implementing the guidelines of the Declaration on Conduct of Party, and there are a number of working groups looking at specific areas, and then moving the consultations on a formal code of conduct along and pressing the idea of an early harvest. Once an agreement on a particular activity is to be reached, it should be implemented immediately, not put in a basket waiting for the entire code to be agreed upon. The ASEAN Regional Forum, it's drawing up a work plan for 2014-16, and its thrust will be to move from confidence building to specific preventative diplomacy measures. And finally, the most important development is that the ASEAN Maritime Forum and the enlarged ASEAN Maritime Forum will now meet back to back. ASEAN will caucus first and then meet with its dialogue partners and work out their agenda for the future. And the most important development then within this framework is that Indonesia will host the first ASEAN and its dialogue partners joint naval training exercises in March, April this year. 17 participants, 28 warships, 4,500 will take part, a very landmark event. So in conclusion, let me say that although ASEAN maritime security policy is fragmented among several institutions, we are seeing progress in implementing practical activities, and we are finally seeing some of the walls breaking down between these bodies and a little bit more coordination. And so with push from the top by the leaders, we can expect maritime cooperation, I think, to enter into a new era this year and beyond. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think for those of us who remain a little mystified by the alphabet soup of ASEAN and ASEAN-centered institutions, that's a fantastic primer. And this whole day will be recorded on the CNAS website for those who want to refer back to this as a resource. Be a great place to point people. And also, I think a relatively optimistic but realistic description of the progress, the practical progress that ASEAN is making despite doubters of its efficiency. So. With that as a great introduction, why don't we turn to Dr. Son to talk to us about how this looks from Hanoi.
Well, good morning, everyone. Let me begin by first thanking the CNAS for inviting me to this very interesting symposium. Well, I'm going to speak about ASEAN's role on maritime security, but I'll go straight to the core issue of ASEAN's attitude towards the South China Sea, which I would say is the core maritime security issue in Southeast Asia at the moment. Now, for ASEAN to play a role on maritime security or on South China Sea, it's critical that ASEAN have unity, because ASEAN works on consensus. ASEAN's unity not only enable it to have a common voice, to get its act together, but also enable ASEAN to play a role in a broader multilateral settings or mechanisms which it initiates in the region, which involves other parties outside of the region as well. And that is a critical role that ASEAN and other countries in the region can contribute to the maritime security environment in the region. So therefore, I'm going to speak about three issues. First, I'm going to speak about how ASEAN's attitude towards the South China Sea have changed over time. And I argue that it has been a change in ASEAN attitude towards the South China Sea lately. Secondly, I'm going to speak about ASEAN's challenges, the challenges that ASEAN faces, as well as the opportunities that ASEAN might have in 2014 for it to play a greater role on the South China Sea. And thirdly, I'm going to speak about then what is the agenda for ASEAN in 2014. Now, let me speak about ASEAN's attitudes on the South China Sea and how it's been changing. ASEAN generally has been keeping a neutral position on the South China Sea. And what does it mean? It means that ASEAN tries to avoid the South China Sea issue whenever it can. It tries not to have a position on who owns what on the territorial disputes per se. And it also doesn't want to get involved into defining what is disputed and what is not disputed. But ASEAN generally have shifted how it perceives the South China Sea issue lately. It is shifted from seeing it as a territorial dispute into more like a geopolitical issue. And that is why ASEAN has been taking a more proactive stance on the South China Sea lately. Not only we have seen that the claimants have become more active in having a greater role in ASEAN on the South China Sea. And we certainly have seen a more proactive role of the Philippines, of Vietnam, but also claimants such as Malaysia, who have traditionally been keeping very quiet on the South China Sea, have also been more active in advocating its views within the ASEAN caucus on the South China Sea. And that is because ASEAN sees that the South China Sea is no longer purely a territorial dispute or a matter of concern among the claimants only. It also sees that the South China Sea has become also a maritime issue which involves the interpretation and application of international law in the context of Southeast Asia. And it also sees that the South China Sea is now becoming a major powers game in the region as well, and that affects everyone in the South China Sea. And as a result, we have seen that even non-claimants are taking more responsibility on the issue as well. Thailand, for example, from being a very restrained country from the issue, is now playing a responsible and even in some way active role on the South China Sea as a coordinator of ASEAN and China relationship. Myanmar also, since it's taken its position as the ASEAN chair this year, have shown that it's not going to avoid the South China Sea issue, and even to some extent it has been playing a proactive role as well. And we've seen that by Myanmar initiating and even releasing a statement at the first event that Myanmar organized as an ASEAN chair this year in Pagan. Because ASEAN has been more forward-looking and become more proactive on the South China Sea, we have seen that ASEAN has regained its solidarity and unity on the South China Sea after a very bad year of failure of 2012. In 2013, for example, we have seen that ASEAN have been very consistently unified on the South China Sea by having the South China Sea consistently placed very high on its agenda in various summits organized by the Brunei. We have seen that ASEAN have been unified in convincing China to agree to start up a consultation process on the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea. And we have seen that ASEAN statements on the South China Sea in, for example, its regular ASEAN ministers meeting joint communique become more nuanced, more substantive than previous statements on the South China Sea. And that reflects a greater ASEAN consensus on the South China Sea. With that sort of momentum that we have seen in ASEAN, what is then to be expected out of ASEAN in 2014? I would say that the greatest challenge for ASEAN in 2014 is how to find a best approach to deal with the Chinese, which is changing its tactic towards its Southeast Asia's neighbors. We have seen that since the beginning of 2013, with the new leadership in power in Beijing, they have shifted its tactics towards its neighbor, what is sometimes termed as charm offensive 2.0 version. And ASEAN thought that despite all realize that this is just a tactical change, China hasn't changed its long-term objectives towards its neighbor, this is just a tactical change, and this is more to get ASEAN's back from the US embrace from its rebalancing strategy towards its Asia. But ASEAN still think that this is a great opportunity to engage China, and it's a great opportunity to push forward with ASEAN's agenda towards China. For example, to get China to talk about the Code of Conduct. So ASEAN has seen that it's a new opportunity there in China, and ASEAN shouldn't waste this opportunity to engage China. But on the other hand, we have seen a new wave of assertiveness by China on not only the East China Sea, but also on the South China Sea as well, by the new fishing regulations of Hainan, by the possibility that it might introduce a new ADIS, air identification zone in South China Sea as well. So ASEAN is going to have to struggle on how to deal with China. That's going to be the greatest challenge. On the other hand, ASEAN will also have to find a way to coordinate major power relations in Southeast Asia and also in other broader multilateral fora that it drives as well. Its greatest challenge is going to how to manage Sino-Japanese relations. ASEAN thinks that it has a role because in previous session we have heard that ASEAN now sees that the East China Sea and the South China Sea is very much interconnected, and It's actually one East Asia region now, and ASEAN needs to play a role in lowering the tension in the East China Sea as well. So how ASEAN is going to play that role is going to be a great challenge for ASEAN in 2014. And if ASEAN can handle or can play a role in the East China Sea, then only ASEAN can have a role in the South China Sea as well. Myanmar chairmanship is going to be very tough this year because it's the first time that Myanmar takes up this position as the chair, and at the time of heightened tension in the region. And Myanmar is very well aware that the South China Sea and maritime security in general is going to be the critical issue of its chairmanship. The good news is that Myanmar is quite well prepared, and it knows that it gets full support from its dialogue partners not to fail like the Cambodian did in 2012. However, it's due to the difficulty of the issue, due to the great dynamic and the uncertainty of the issue, it's still a big issue there to watch for. Another issue, a great challenge for ASEAN is going to be Thailand's role. We know that Thailand is playing a critical role in coordinating ASEAN and China relationship. It has played its role very well in the past 2 years, and as a result, ASEAN and China were able to get the ball rolling on the code of conduct. But whether or not Thailand is going to get its own domestic politics in order for it to play an external role this year and the year after this is going to be, it's still in a question. And ASEAN is going to have to rely on Thailand a lot, especially this year, because this is the year that we expect that some substantive progress is going to happen on the code of conduct. However, the good news there is that much of Thailand's role is in the hand of its senior official, who is a very skillful diplomat with many years of experience in multilateral affairs, Sihasak. So despite that Thailand is in trouble, Sihasak's performance is still very well, and he still gets the confidence and trust from both ASEAN and China, and that is the good news to hope for. Now, the opportunity for ASEAN this year is that Myanmar, it's doing it for the first time, so as I said earlier, it gets full support not only from within ASEAN, but also from other external power, including China. Nobody wants Myanmar to fail. Despite Thailand's difficulties, Myanmar and Thailand's team is considered to be the dream team to push forwards with South China Sea agenda this year, because Myanmar and Thailand are both non-claimants, and so they are considered neutral and have the trust of both ASEAN and China to push forwards with the South China Sea issue. And also they are considered some very active, quite active member of ASEAN. ASEAN-China's relationship is being warmed up last year, and that might be a good momentum for the relationship to roll over this year as well. And another opportunity, as ASEAN see it, is China's hosting of ASEM this year. It's a diplomatic opportunity for China to show in words and in deeds its good neighborliness policy being realized in its chairmanship of ASEM. So what is then ASEAN's agenda for 2014? We have held talks with our colleagues around ASEAN and Myanmar in particular. Then the key objective for Myanmar in its chairmanship is going to maintain and strengthen ASEAN unity in 2014, and also to keep South China Sea issue high on the agenda. And that means that ASEAN will have South China Sea not only within its own fora, but also on the ASEAN Regional Forum, on the East Asia Summit, on the ARF, and so on. Secondly, the second objective of ASEAN this year would be to respond effectively whenever there's a provocation. For example, when China is going to implement the new fishing rules by Hainan province, ASEAN is expected to voice up its concern again. Whether or not ASEAN will be able to get its act together, if such a thing happens, is going to be an objective and a challenge for ASEAN. Also, in anticipation of China's possible introduction of ADs on the South China Sea, ASEAN will also have to find a way to respond to such a provocative act as well. Another issue ASEAN will have to be aware is when there is a new developments on the Philippines arbitration case. ASEAN as a whole have been keeping a quiet stance on the arbitration case, but I don't think that ASEAN is viable for ASEAN to keep this quietness forever. It will have to find a way to express its position on the arbitration case. And given that the new developments on the arbitration case is expected as early as end of March, ASEAN will have to find a way to express its views on it. And fourthly, I think the most important goal for ASEAN this year is to get some real substantive movement on the code of conduct. And I think the realistic objective is to find a way to convince China to agree on very specific plan on how to move forward the code of conduct process. So far, China have agreed to enter into consultations with ASEAN on the code of conduct. However, nothing specific was agreed, and ASEAN thought that this is just a delaying tactic by China in order to convince the Philippines to drop the arbitration case, maybe. But ASEAN will need to find a way to at least agree with China on the specific target dates for a code of conduct to, no matter how long it will take, but to agree on a specific target date. And a very viable target date for such a code of conduct is 2015, when ASEAN is going to form its community. And by that time, ASEAN will want to have some sort of agreement with China on the code of conduct. Another thing on the code of conduct is to be able to agree to an early harvest, like Kautai have mentioned earlier. Whenever ASEAN and China can agree on some specific elements of the code of conduct, that element can be put into implementation right away without having to wait for the full code of conduct to be agreed upon, which is expected to take quite a long time. And that early element of the code of conduct could be some codes to avoid incidents at sea, and for example, on how to treat the fishermen when they are caught by either party on the South China Sea, for example, or codes on how to run operationalize the network of hotlines, which is booming in the region. Hotlines or communications channels between various government agencies or line agencies operating in the South China Sea, how to operationalize it, and how to use them in the case of escalation of tension in the South China Sea. Those are the immediate objective or immediate elements of the code of conduct which can be realized by ASEAN and China and put into implementation. As a conclusion, we thought that ASEAN is still best. The best role of ASEAN, in other words, is to promote a rule-based order in the South China Sea. And this is the common interest of not only ASEAN, but also by other extra-regional countries like Japan, US, and so on. So extra-regional countries should lend a hand in supporting ASEAN's role in making the rules of the game transparent in the South China Sea context, and help ASEAN keep a very transparent region, and help ASEAN enforce and build the capacity for ASEAN to enforce such a rules-based order in the South China Sea. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much. That was fantastic. I mean, just a couple issues to highlight. I think it's very interesting for folks to think about the possible role for ASEAN in the East China Sea. Often talk about managing the US-Sino competition, but to think about a role for ASEAN between Japan and China is very interesting. Certainly interesting to hear Thailand and Myanmar described as the dream team on South China Sea, but a very convincing argument, but not one would regularly hear in Washington, but I think very compelling. And then certainly the issue of the arbitration case and how that butts up against the issue of ASEAN unity and this issue of promoting a rules-based order. Could there be a better test of the rules-based order, but obviously butting against the interests of the institution and also particular individual states within the region who are going to have to modulate their behavior or rhetoric with respect to China. So great set of issues. And we're going to turn to Satu now to give us a perspective of the role of the United States in all of this.
Great. Well, thank you very much to CNAS, to Eli and Patrick and others for inviting me to participate today. I thought I'd sort of do two things. One is talk about, we haven't talked in great detail this morning about Secretary Russell's comments, which obviously relate directly to the subject of this panel, which is a 2014 agenda. And the second is to sort of make some general conceptual comments. I think they might follow on Dr. Song's comments about an ASEAN agenda, but frame it a little bit differently. So let me try to do that. For those of you who've read the Secretary's remarks, I think there's things that 4 parties should do, essentially. What PRC should do, what ASEAN is asked to do, what PRC and ASEAN are asked to do together, and what the US intends to do. It's a way of organizing what's in the document, and I think it's important. And I'd like to make some comments about that, because I think it's quite interesting how it's laid out and why it's important, and a very effective way for the US to proceed, and what implications there are for ASEAN. Essentially, PRC is asked to do 2 things: clarify its claims based on land features, and not issue an ADIZ in the South China Sea. Those are the big asks. The things that ASEAN is asked to do is also to abide by land features in making claims. And you'll note that that was not in the text that was submitted for the record, but was in the prepared remarks of Secretary Russell. And I think that's important. And the second was to avail peaceful dispute settlement mechanisms, such as the arbitration case. What the PRC and ASEAN are asked to do together, jointly, cooperatively, is to move very quickly towards a COC, which we've talked a lot about, Dr. Song has talked about, we'll talk a bit more about, I'm sure. And then the US has laid out a set of agenda items and actions that it is doing, will do, or should do. And those, of course, press for actions consistent with international law, strong diplomatic and military presence, strengthening and modernizing alliances, building robust partnerships, bolstering maritime domain awareness and capacity, strengthening regional institutions, and new initiatives like the expanded ASEAN Seafarers Training Initiative. Why is this important? I think it's important because the calibration of who does what and is important in how we combine the rule-based approach with the more, if you will, pragmatic or practical approach towards alliances and partnerships. Let me make 6 or 7 observations about this. First, there are 2 things that are very noticeable for me in the statement. One is there is no reference to a US role in building the ASEAN unity that you talked about, which is quite interesting. Now, there are perfectly sensible and reasonable reasons why this might be the case, but it's noticeable in its absence because it's been one of the key things the US has clearly done diplomatically. The second is the gap between the text statement about land features as a basis for claims in the prepared remarks versus the remarks as made. And I think that's important because the reporting in the public press has all been about China must abide by land features. But you'll notice in the prepared, the text is delivered, it's all claimants should use land features as the basis. And I'll come back to why this is important for my thinking for our strategy in the region. The second observation I'd make is that both in detail and scope, it's China's behavior in the South China Sea that is at issue primarily. And that's made very clear by a set of very specific things that China has done. Hainan fishing rights, on and on. You can go through the list, and we can discuss that. Scarborough Shoal, hydrocarbon blocks for bid, et cetera. The third is that if you compare what's going on, essentially what's being asked of ASEAN and PRC is exactly the same. There's no difference in what's being asked on the issue of rules and norms. And again, I'll come back to why that is important. The fourth observation is that for what the US is going to do, those things, as I said, strengthening and modernizing alliances, building robust partnerships, maritime domain awareness, we're only going to do those with ASEAN. We're not going to do them with China, which supports our alliance and partnership-based approach to managing maritime security. Those are not things we can do with China. The fifth observation is that, to my mind, this imbalance between a demand for rules-based approach for all parties to the disputes, combined with the specific elements of U.S. policy that support alliances and partnerships, is exactly the right balance in managing the U.S.-China relationship and consistently supporting alliances and partnerships. It will never be a perfect balance, but we will tack between these two in order to maximize American leverage and role. It will not be effective for us in the long run to support rules-based norms only for one party in the dispute and support alliances and partnerships. This brings us to a very, I think, critical role. And I would go one step further and argue it's very useful for ASEAN because the U.S. role for ASEAN can only be effective if the U.S., which is seen as the most important shaper of China's behavior, has leverage with China. So I think it's important in that respect. The sixth thing I would note on these remarks is that, unfortunately, the downside of this approach is that the way it has been framed probably doesn't make China any more willing to do the kinds of things we'd like it to do. Whatever those drivers are, and I haven't a clue, Stephanie and others in the room who follow China can say, I can't see why China would abide by these things in the near term. It's not clear to me at all. And simultaneously, the downside is many of the things we want to do in the alliance and partnership-based relationships aren't going to, therefore, immediately follow just because we've said we want to do them. That is to say, we will still continue to have to discuss with our Philippine friends the nature of our military relationship. We will continue to have to work with our friends in Malaysia about what is the proper and effective balance between enhanced U.S. Royal Malaysian Navy cooperation and Malaysian desire to be, as you put it, Dr. Song, traditionally quite quiet and reticent. I mean, this recent incident of the Malaysian naval chief's response to the James Shoal activities is, I think, an indication of this constant calibration that will continue to take place in the region. And it'll take place in the region, Stephanie and I both heard this comment, that people want to feel our presence but not see it. So my point here is simply say the downsides of such what I think is a very effective approach for the United States always has the downside as not being sufficient for China and too much for ASEAN. The seventh and final comment I'd make on this is, to my mind, where ASEAN can be most helpful as we move forward in the agenda is really thinking through how much it wants to do with us in the alliance dimension and the partnership dimension. I realize that in all cases, these are sovereign issues and difficult issues, but without considerable progress in those alliances and partnerships, I think we cannot do all of that ASEAN wants us to do in supporting maritime security in the region. And of course, that brings me to some conceptual comments, and I'll end there. And there are just four that build on the terrific Dr. Song's presentation about specific things, challenges, and opportunities. And I'd frame them this way. First, for the last decade or so, ASEAN has sought internationalization because internationalization has been seen as beneficial to ASEAN. Getting Japan, getting ROK, getting Australia, getting China, getting the US, getting even India, which is somewhat afar, but getting India, is generally seen as good for ASEAN. I would like to at least lay on the table the notion that internationalization of the kind brought to the fore by maritime security challenges has the risk or potential of turning to the second conceptual problem in ASEAN, which is internationalization becomes strategic exposure. Internationalization, in part, has sought to cushion strategic exposure of ASEAN because the ASEAN project, in some ways, a balance between maintaining sovereignty and giving it up. And the level and dimensions of the ASEAN project are essentially intended to make sure that sovereignty is not given up too much or too fast. So strategic exposure of the kind that our friend Ken Jimbo spoke of could, if not handled properly, be overbearing on the internationalization of ASEAN, a US-Japan effort, a US-Japan-Australia effort, a US-India effort, whatever the permutations and specifics could be. All it is simply to say, let us tread there carefully so that internationalization doesn't cross over into strategic exposure, which undermines ASEAN coherence, doesn't build it. The third issue is, as I spoke about, is one of our central tenets, and our colleague Professor Thayer spoke about the different elements of the mechanisms and organizations. I guess my view is multilateralism has been, as I said, designed in part to cushion claims on ASEAN sovereignty. But if multilateralism is pushed too hard to do the things in the security domain, it also has the risk of undermining ASEAN unity. And finally, I think it's very useful what Dr. Song pointed out. It struck me that, and our colleague Christopher Young at NDU has done some very interesting data-based work in the open source domain on activities done in the South China Sea. And there are essentially two findings. He could speak to this, but his work is available. His report is coming out. One is that neither China or ASEAN have gone to the ends of the spectrum in their activities on the South China Sea. Not full conflict, not a request for the US to decidedly and determinedly take one side or another. In other words, they're operating within a band of spectrum. And the second finding from this data set is that the relative role of players within the ASEAN claimants has been much more active on the part of Vietnam and the Philippines, and much lower, quite naturally, on the part of countries like Brunei and Malaysia. A third point that I would make, and I offered this to Chris the other day when he spoke at our place, is that the third element of that is that the non-claimant states are likely to have a profound impact on determining the outcome and the trajectory of discussions, as they did in Cambodia in 2012, as Indonesia did when it put together the post-Cambodia negotiations, and now we have the suggestion of the dream team between Myanmar and Thailand. So there's a great irony here that non-claimant states may, in fact, over 2014, play a particularly important role, all the more complicated by the fact that if you look at the constellation of forces, if you will, of claimants versus non-claimants, there are great transitions happening in all of those non-claimant states this year. So that's it. That's all I have to say on both the conceptual sort of cautions about how the ASEAN agenda is implemented and the specifics on how US policy straddles or rides this difficult balance between supporting allies and partners and having a rule-based approach.
That's great. I'm glad we're taping these presentations. These have to be, honestly, some of the best that I've heard on this issue in a long time. I mean, just to highlight a couple tensions before passing over to our discussants, I think it's interesting the tension that a couple tensions that Satu noted. The first being, in some ways, this aspirational quality to the regional order. And as we walk down this path, what happens with the fact that half of our brain is thinking of this rules-based order and the other half is convincing us that China's never going to abide by it? And when does that, when does the reality of those contradictions start to, do we really start to see those as the kind of rationalization that Dr. Thayer talked about and the progress potentially this year on the code of conduct come to the fore? And just the other comment I would make in regards to the balancing act that the United States is trying to make that Satu described, I'm wondering, Admiral Pama talked about the United States sending mixed signals to the region. I'm wondering if that's something that can be improved upon or whether that's in many ways a systemic outcome of the kind of balancing act the United States is trying to carry out in the region and what that means looking forward for regional stability and the South China Sea and related issues. So very interesting presentations. Now we'll turn over to Yuki and Walter for some questions, comments, and our understanding, Ambassador Mirpuri unfortunately is not going to be able to make it today, so we'll be able to continue this panel to 12 o'clock and hopefully have an opportunity to open it up for the audience. Been very patient today for questions and comments. Yuki, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Eli, and I'd like to thank, again, CNAS for having me here this morning. Very interesting set of presentation, both the first panel and the second panel, and I'm not an expert in Southeast Asia, so to me it was a great learning experience throughout the morning. But just wanted to raise a couple of questions as we listen to what will be more substantively interesting Walter's comment, but also to the Q&A. First is this centrality of ASEAN theme that as Dr. Thayer briefly discussed this in his taped presentation. On one hand, ASEAN has declared its aspiration and its strong interest in keeping ASEAN as the centrally ingrained institution as countries in the region in the Asia-Pacific moves to create their regional security architecture. But at the same time, on the issue of maritime security specifically, as Dr. Thayer pointed out, the South China Sea has been treated separately for a long time. And then I think Dr. Son's very interesting presentation also laid out that for a long time, until quite recently, ASEAN chose to be neutral in the South China Sea. But when it comes, so at which point this centrality of ASEAN, which is the aspiration of ASEAN, but at the same time, this constant pull toward try to remain neutral, try to stay away from a politically controversial issue in the South China Sea in specific, because of the all kinds of regional development between Philippines and China, or Chinese claimant on fisheries, and the speculation of whether China might declare ADIS over the South China Sea airspace also, that's driving the ASEAN countries to take a little bit more proactive stance toward this issue. But without those driving force, what everybody kind of has to think about is that would ASEAN reacting this way had not those driving forces be? And to me, that is the great potential of ASEAN, but then at the same time, it could be a great limitation of ASEAN as an international organization as we move forward. So that's one point, which is very closely related to the how much real progress that code of conduct discussion can happen between China and ASEAN this year. And another question that I'd like to raise is connecting to the Dr. Jimbo's presentation in the first panel, which is the connectivity of East China Sea and South China Sea. In Japan, this is a very recent discussion. For quite a while, East China Sea issue was East China Sea issue. It was very close and dear to Japanese own national security interest in immediate vicinity of its territory. But South China Sea is more about afloat, aloof, international norms, standard types of concept. But I think as ironically, Chinese behavior in both of these issues is really linking up these two issues in Japanese mind. And if you only have to go back to the first major foreign policy speech that Prime Minister Abe made after he came back to the office. In fact, he was planning to make this speech in Indonesia, but then because of the hostage crisis, he couldn't deliver this actual speech, which is quite important. If you go back to that speech that he was going to deliver in Jakarta, he talked about 5 principles of Japan's ASEAN partnership, and the first issue that he lays out is, first 2 issues, in fact, lays out is that the Japan and ASEAN shared interest in open common domains, and the open and free and democratic space, and the shared interest in maintaining those values as Japan and ASEAN moves forward in its relationships. So that connectivity, I think, becomes a very important issue as both Japan and the ASEAN continue to think about this maritime security issue. But combining that with Japan's own aspiration of proactively participating in creating international peace, which is articulated in National Security Strategy issued in last year, and then also the aspiration of a U.S.-Japan alliance together, which can be seen in the last year's October's 2+2 statement, in more proactive engagement in the regional security order. So those three driving forces are kind of coming together in this last 12 months or so. So this is just a thought-out, open thinking process, but maybe at the ADABM plus sideline, there might be a possibility that three entities could explore of having kind of an unofficial track 2 level coordination meeting on how US, Japan, and ASEAN approaches this maritime security issues, particularly how to effectively respond to the provocations and the unilateral attempt to change the status quo. I think it's highly important that some kind of a common standard procedure is agreed upon between U.S. and Japan and U.S., Japan, and ASEAN, so that I guess in a weird way, doesn't allow China any room to drive a wedge between East China Sea and South China Sea and try to treat as two separate issues. There's always, I think, a desire on China's part to treat East China Sea issue with Japan as a part of a history issue, more of a immediate East Asia rivalry issue, and try to treat it separately with the South China Sea. But as we look at, if we want to look at this issue more holistically from a maritime security perspective broadly, it is very desirable that some kind of a coordination discussion needs to take place sooner rather than later. And lastly, I would like to end my questions with this one important comment that Satu referred to, which is the ASEAN needs to think through how it wants to pursue alliance or partnership relation with the United States. And that's actually also common with Japan too, because most of US allies in Asia has its alliance dilemma. Doesn't want to get too close to get wrapped up dragged into the conflict. That is not necessarily in their interest, but then they all get really nervous when U.S. starts acting really disengaged from the region. And that is the dilemma that both Japan and alliances and partners in Southeast Asia has. And then I think those are the common issues that connects the Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia on this issue. So with that, I'd like to pass it back to Walter.
Thank you. Thank you, Eli, and thanks to CNAS for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity. It's great to go last because then I can comment on everything that's happened before. I'm the last word, so maybe I can stretch it out all the way through Q&A and no one will get to say anything else. But I wanted to start out actually commenting on something that Stephanie said in the last panel. I really don't think the U.S. is any part of the problem here. That is in terms of our lack of subtlety, our lack of nuance, et cetera. And I think, in fairness to Stephanie, I think she's partly being self-deprecating and, gracious about the U.S. role in the region. But the only way that the U.S. is a part of the problem is to the extent it's not being itself. The idea that the U.S. would follow ASEAN's lead on managing this problem is almost bizarro world. The ASEAN has been failing at this effort in the South China Sea for 20 years, and that we would kind of calibrate our approach to ASEAN sensitivities when those sensitivities are actually always shifting, and they're usually expressed in opposition to the thing we've last done. We're either too soft or too hard or whatever it is. We never seem to be able to hit the sweet spot. But that we would use that reaction as a way to calibrate our own efforts, I think, is a huge mistake. I wanted to comment on Dr. Song's presentation first. My role here as discussant is to be critical, so forgive me for criticizing your your work. It was a very comprehensive look at the region, but and the issue involved. But I think it's very optimistic. I don't actually see ASEAN's position evolving over time in any significant, important ways on any of this. They're basically taking the same approach that they've taken for 20 years, emphasizing the same things over and over again, the application of UNCLOS, although it doesn't require them actually to support the Philippines, who have filed a case in that regard, refraining from provocative activity, that sort of thing. The need for consultative mechanisms. These are all things that they repeat over and over again. And if you look at the most recent two examples, that is the Chinese announcement of the 80s in the East China Sea, they coincidentally had a summit in Tokyo about the same time, and actually said nothing new in that context. The press played it up a little bit, and the Japanese Foreign Ministry, I think, helped them along in that regard. But the truth is, if you look at the statement, it is nothing new. It is the same old rhetoric, the same statements. You could apply it to the Chinese, you could apply it to the Filipinos, you could apply it to the Vietnamese, you could apply it to anyone involved in the conflict. And if you don't think the Chinese use it to that effect, then you don't know the Chinese that well. I mean, they're just as well could sidle up to the Singaporeans or the Cambodians and say, I'm glad you guys said that. The Filipinos are being very irresponsible. They really should do better in the South China Sea, let alone the Japanese in the East China Sea. If you look at their response to the fishing regulations that went into effect in January in South China Sea, they had a meeting in Bagan at the time. It didn't say anything new. It was all the same. It was the same sort of things, focusing on UNCLOS, exercising restraint, these sorts of things that it says every time without specific reference to China. On the charm offensive, the charm offensive 2.0, there's a big problem with the charm offensive is that it includes everyone except the Philippines.
Japan.
Well, yeah, but you're right. But Dr. Sohn was talking about a charm offensive in South China Sea, as I heard him. But yeah, you're right. If ASEAN should be sort of all for one for all, really. And they all have found it very convenient to throw the Filipinos overboard in their latest interaction with the Chinese. Thailand's role in consultation, sort of working through the COC and dealing with China, I don't see that they've been particularly effective. So they started something that we're calling, because the Chinese called it this, the beginning of official consultations. What the hell have they been doing all this time? They haven't been consulting. So we're going to pick up the ASEAN rhetoric and we're going to agree that yes, this is very significant. They're doing official consultations now. What were they doing in 2000 and 2002? The thing that led to the Declaration of Conduct. They were actually negotiating a COC, and they failed. And so they put out a Declaration of Conduct. What were they doing in the lead up to 2011 when they put out the guidelines on implementation of the DOC? They were working on some sort of COC. And in fact, a lot of the press misreported at the time that they had reached this great conclusion on a COC. So the fact that they have begun official consultations, I think, is pretty meaningless, or it's the sort of progress that is just so minute that it doesn't do much good to recognize it. I think Carl's presentation represents another pitfall that we can get into. He knows this stuff incredibly well. He's probably the best, literally, in the world in dissecting what these various organizations are up to, the sort of alphabet soup of ASEAN. But I think that's another pitfall in that it doesn't really matter. I mean, unless you're getting to the things that really count, and the things that really count are China's claims in the South China Sea, the shape of the table doesn't matter. He comes up at the end and says, there's this major development that's occurring where the expert working groups and the ARF mechanisms are merging, and the shape of the table is not going to solve this issue. We've looked at it every possible shape imaginable, and that's not what's going to make the difference at the end of the day. In terms of what the U.S. can do, just in closing, I'll say I think the U.S. has to be more itself. I mean, the one thing that Carl did say that wasn't working so well was the highest level, at the summit level with political leaders. That's where we need to be making a bigger noise. I think the U.S. should be much more assertive in those situations. I think we should be pushing ASEAN to make more specific references. Okay, the Philippines is not the problem. Vietnam's not the problem. China's the problem. Why can't we say that in a document that comes out of ASEAN? We can't because several of the other members have equities in those relationships that they don't, in that relationship that they don't want to jeopardize. I think the U.S. continues to forcefully assert its own position on international customary law through its freedom of navigation program. I think that's essential that it continue to do that. I think it needs to be more focused on the Philippines especially, but also Vietnam to the extent Vietnam wants to help, as opposed to focusing on ASEAN's initiatives and how Filipino interests get sort of massaged by ASEAN's process. I think we need to be much more direct and upfront with the Philippines on the front end of that process. And then the bottom line is I think we have to determine what American interests are in the region and work accordingly. Our interests and ASEAN's interests are not the same. And I think over the last several years, as we have sort of ramped up in Washington on ASEAN, we are adopting this, occasionally, this feel-good ASEAN approach to these issues. And we are taking their interests on board and following practices and organizations that are intended to further their interests, not necessarily intended to serve American interests.
Great, thank you. Very important perspective, I think. I definitely want to give Dr. Son and Satu a chance to respond, but wanted to see first if there were any questions or comments from the participants in the audience. Raise your hand if you do. All right, ma'am. We can maybe round up a couple, and then we'll come back down the line here.
Thank you.
And if you could, identify yourself at the beginning of your comment, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, CNAS, and thank you all the presenters. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I'm very thankful that Dr. Nguyen Hong Sơn is here. My first question to Dr. Nguyen is, what do you think the role of Vietnam is to strengthen ASEAN, given all the suggestions and recommendations that you offer to ASEAN? Have you offered that to the government of Vietnam? Exactly every point. Okay. And I also thank Dr. Lohman for this statement that Stephanie said. ASEAN doesn't want to see the U.S. in the region. That's not right. We need the presence of the U.S. The minute that the 7th Fleet show up, George Washington show up, it makes a significant difference. We need the presence of the U.S., the stronger presence. And also, I would like to ask Dr. Satu, you said that right now, the key problem is that the U.S. doesn't really have a leverage with China to change. And also that ASEAN and China, both the conflicts hasn't come to the point that the U.S. feel that it needs to take a different, a more proactive position. So exactly what do you think should happen to help to move the balance forward to a more positive balance for the region? Thank you.
Okay, one more from the audience, and then we'll.
My name is Edward Jeep. I work for inside the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And I just was interested if anybody, I've already in a sidebar spoken to Admiral Pama about this, but if there was any insights on types of military forces. I mean, there seems to be a lot of churn within all nations, their military forces and rates of change. So what types of military forces will help this situation and need to be developed either collectively or individually by ASEAN nations, and which ones or which ideas will not help, which will be hurtful to this process or at least to peace in general, but more to the point, to the kind of relationship that all the nations together need to preserve. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me just add one more question, and then we'll come down the line here. I guess if you had to contrast Walter's presentation with Carl's, there is a bit of a glass half full, glass half empty view of where ASEAN is in its own maturity. We're looking toward, for instance, the ASEAN Defense Minister meeting in Hawaii with Secretary Hagel in April. Clearly, you see very clearly there the ASEAN hesitancy. I think it's going to be a relatively unofficial meeting. I don't think we're expecting a joint statement. Certainly, it's not going to say any of the things Walter was suggesting, if there's a statement at all, which I don't think there necessarily will be. I think the question, for our presenters here is, as ASEAN is doing its own balancing act between the United States and China, does that mean that we're likely to see incremental progress in the years ahead as the institutions rationalize or alternatively, is this going to run aground in stalemate? I mean, in many ways, that's the million-dollar question. I think we've heard differing perspectives on that today. So why don't we start, and we'll come down the line maybe. I know there's a lot on the table, but if you want to take 3 or 4 minutes each, and if Yuki and Walter have any final comments as well.
Well, okay, I'd like to first respond to Madam's question about Vietnam's role to strengthen ASEAN unity. I would say that Vietnam played a great role in putting back the South China Sea on ASEAN's agenda after a long period of neglect, I would say, by ASEAN on the South China Sea. For example, in 2010, when Vietnam served as chair of ASEAN, we played a critical role in highlighting the South China Seas as a security issue back into ASEAN's agenda. And from then on, the South China Sea is now center of ASEAN's security agenda. Vietnam played, again, a very proactive role when we served as the country coordinator for ASEAN and China relationship. And that is when we pushed ASEAN and China towards implementation of the Code of Conduct. Then we adopted the guidelines to implement the Code of Conduct, despite the fact that the guideline received a lot of criticism for its lack of substance. But without such a movement, there wouldn't have been a move towards the Code of Conduct, because there needs to be progress on the declaration of the conduct first before ASEAN and China could move to the Code of Conduct. So ASEAN has a lot of things to deal with the process, and we saw a progress in the process is a progress. Thirdly, on the COC negotiation, despite that there's been a lot of criticism on its substance and the thing that ASEAN was able to achieve with China. But there is a progress already within ASEAN in discussing the Code of Conduct. Don't forget that ASEAN agreed on the elements of the Code of Conduct, and to have an ASEAN's common understanding on an issue where not every ASEAN member has an interest on is a progress that needs to be recognized. Secondly, on the question of ASEAN's neutrality on the issue, on this point, I think ASEAN is very much like the US. ASEAN and US both are neutral on the territorial issue, but ASEAN and the US are not neutral on how the territorial issue needs to be resolved. And the US has made this very clear, and ASEAN also implicitly made it very clear. ASEAN is not neutral on how the territorial issue needs to be resolved. It insists on a set of principles on how it should be resolved. And in this sense, I would say that ASEAN is taking side, not with any claimants, but with international law. And that's precisely what the US has taken the position on. And in that way, ASEAN and the US is a strong alliance on this. About connectivity between East China Sea and the South China Sea, well, certainly ASEAN and many other countries in the region see that this is one issue, because behind is China's expansionism, behind is China's factionalism, behind is the PLA rising assertiveness that drives China's foreign policy. On China's view, this is also one issue, because behind the East China Sea and the South China Sea is the US, which is instigating all this problem, regardless of what it is true or not. So when all sides see that there's a connectivity between East China Sea and the South China Sea, then it is one issue. I really appreciate Walter's comment and criticism, constructive criticisms on my points. But my points in arguing ASEAN is making a progress or is shifting its position on the South China Sea is very much relative, which I mean that, well, today's ASEAN position is a lot more positive than in 2012, for example. That by no means to say that ASEAN's position is enough, or ASEAN's common voice or common actions on the South China Sea is enough. But I'm just merely reflecting a relative progress that ASEAN has made on the South China Sea. Thank you.
My issue is maximizing our leverage, U.S. leverage, in terms of playing a role in the region that is consistent with U.S. national interests. I think there is always going to be a very, very intricate and delicate balance between rules and norms and shoring up partnerships and alliances that are effectively able to do things when they need to do them. This isn't physics, this is international relations. That's the nature of the game. We're not going to end up with a variable that is distinct and clear. This is an ongoing process. It's not the end of a process. So, Eric, if I may call on, forgive me, Andrew Erickson yesterday made a very interesting point, one that I hadn't sort of paid enough attention to. But China's behavior in its near seas is somewhat different from its cooperative activities elsewhere. As I understand it, what I think is in our interest is to get China to play by rules that are global norms. In the immediate vicinity, it has much core interest, harder interests that it will seek and therefore resist those norms. Elsewhere, it will seek to dock onto existing norms and work with others. There's a delta between those two. That delta will be closed over time. It's not going to be closed immediately or perfectly. So the issue is leveraging not China, which is bringing it up to global standards, but leveraging U.S. ability to achieve its interests. And it does both things, which leads me to my second point. It is my perception that it is not the U.S. that is hesitant and resistant to doing alliances and partnership building. It is the region that to some extent has constraints on how far it's willing to go to the U.S. And there are all kinds of reasons for this. There are domestic political reasons. There's public perception reasons, which is why you get a statement like, we want to feel your presence but not see it. There's resistance about sovereignty. There's resistance about past history. So again, it's not physics, it's negotiations. We will continue to push ways in which we can cooperate with our allies in robust partnerships. Potential allies and partnerships may be somewhat hesitant. Similarly, to my mind, if you look at our 2010 October statement on multilateralism, there's a huge delta between what ASEAN has traditionally wanted to do with multilateralism and what the US wants to do with multilateralism. In fact, the piece I'm working on now is called A Usable Multilateralism for the US. We want certain things to come out of that. There's going to be some, again, delta between what ASEAN is willing to accommodate and what we want to do. And we're going to have to close that gap. The downside is there. As I said, I can't get my head around what it is that would make China abide by these rules and norms. But I do think one thing. It is my assessment, I'll just state it, that China doesn't want to do things that prematurely get it into a scrape with the United States. That I do buy as an analytical assessment. I see no hurry, no pacing, no pushing of the envelope on that. They are going to continue. There's a great dance between these awful images that we've been talking about all morning, and I was trying to make fun of it. Forgive me if I'm being too light about a very serious subject about sovereignty and claims, but we've got salami tactics, global rules, managing between the US and PRC, and presence and projection of the US. To me, those two things, the presence and projection of the US ability in the region, is the key on which everything else hinges. It's the variable that will shape the degree and amount of salami slicing, the degree and amount of whether rules and norms are affordable and acceptable, et cetera. As for half-full ASEAN, Walter and I have discussed this over the years. I just have to go on record. I haven't changed my view since I wrote a piece called ASEAN, a glass half full. So, it's not a pretty picture. It is not a pretty process. But I count on 4 structural things. 1, the U.S. is now engaged with every ASEAN country in a way that it hasn't been since 1975. 2, ASEAN has institutions that they didn't have. 3, ASEAN is doing things in institutions even if they are first order. And 4, we can now talk about something about ASEAN centrality in the context of a wider Asia-Pacific. That divide between ASEAN and Northeast Asia that Ken referred to is no longer present. These are structural changes. Again, they're not end-state changes, but they're important structural changes for our policy.
All right. How about 1 minute for wave tops from Yuki and Walter?
In that 1 minute, I try to, I don't offer the answer, but I'd like to offer some food for thought to the question about military forces necessary in the region. Japan's National Defense Group Program guideline may be helpful in thinking through this for ASEAN. Its approach to defense planning is threefold. Its own effort, alliance cooperation with the United States, and an effort to improve the broader international security environment. So if you kind of apply that to ASEAN nations as it each thinks through its own military forces, force posture and planning, that could offer some guides, like what is it that it needs to do it on its own, what it can achieve by alliance or partnership with the United States, and then what it can do amongst each other within Southeast Asia to improve the general security environment in that region. But in order for them to go through that rational calculus, I think this comes up again, and Walter emphasized it too, that the credibility that U.S. will be visibly present when situation calls for it is critically important in my mind. And I think that is the dilemma that Japan tackles now as it looks at East China Sea situation. And then I think that's very much shared concern for the ASEAN countries too.
Okay, I'll try to be
Now you really get the last
in
word.
that 1 minute. Yeah, exactly. I only have 5 seconds to deliver it. No, that's one on the military stuff. I like to leave that to military guys. They know best equipment and that sort of thing. I can't really talk to that. But I will say, I think Philippines' military needs are first order of business. I think Vietnam has some strategic decisions it needs to make, and that includes some progress on human rights and other such things before we sell lethal equipment to Vietnam. The details can be worked out by the guys who know that equipment far better than I do. I just wanted to agree with Satu. The last point he made, I do think ASEAN's doing a lot of constructive things, and I do think we ought to be engaged in what they're doing. The question is how much those constructive things they're doing, like the 4 activities that Carl mentioned, how much of those have direct bearing on the issue at hand, and that's the Chinese claims in the South China Sea. So to the extent those issues are separated, that they're making some progress on maritime issues, that's great. There's also the problem of the South China Sea, which is floundering and has already run aground, I would say, in answer to Eli's question. I would just close by saying that I think as we move forward developing American policy, we just have to be careful not to get dragged down into the ASEAN way of doing business. It's been very successful for them, for the 10 of them within ASEAN. It's not necessarily the way that we want to approach it. So take a look at the track record and realize that ASEAN has never done anything effective on these kind of disputes except under extreme international pressure. Take a look at the dynamics, where the interests of each of those countries lie, and look at the real prospects that we're ever going to get anything done on South China Sea working through those mechanisms. Look at all of those before you decide how we ought to approach the issues there.
Great, thank you. Now, before you join me in thanking the panel, let me just say 2 things briefly. First of all, thank you very much to CNAS staff and interns who made this event possible, while the rest of our colleagues are at home drinking hot cocoa. And second, mark your calendars for March 7th. In our ongoing series on maritime security, we'll be doing an event much like this on managing the air commons, which will get after the ADIS issue in the East China Sea and the South China Sea head on. So with that, thank you very much for coming out today. Great discussion.
Thank you. Dr. Sun, great to see you.
Good to see you.